Hey everybody, this is TotalGamerJunkie. I want to welcome you all back to my channel. So in this video, I want to go over a list of narrative plot holes in Life is Strange Double Exposure. Now this video is actually, I didn't even know about this website until I saw a post from Nicefield on Twitter. And the post was a link to CBR, and it's a news article talking about all the plot holes in Double Exposure, which I've had a read over them, and I gotta be honest with you, it's, at least from what I've read, and I'm going to give my thoughts on each plot hole, it's clear that Deck 9 did not know what to do with Max at all. Like, I do think they just brought her back just because, oh, it's Max Caulfield, remember her from the first and best game of the Life is Strange series? Yeah, we're bringing her back. Like, to me, it was just a cash grab and with sprinkled member berries just to get people hyped, which is why I'm not hyped for the second one. I may get it just to play it again so that people, if you're still on the fence for it, you can watch my playthroughs and see how that one goes and decide if you want to get it or not. But ultimately, I guess I'm just, after what they did to Max, like, I'm not really interested in Deck 9 Life is Strange anymore, which is contradictory to what I just said. But anyways, I'm going to be reading through all of these plot holes, and I'm going to give my thoughts on them. Now, if you want to read them yourself and not listen to this video, check the link in the description below. Meet Moses, Max's other new best friend. Wait, scratch that, acquaintance. Life is Strange Double Exposure revealed a lot about its characters during its marketing campaign, including Moses. He was presented as a member of a trio, with his counterparts being Max and Safi. In the first chapters, players can look back at text between Max and Moses and see the two of them making plans together. It's clear they spend a lot of time together. Moses is Safi's best friend first, and Safi is Max's best friend, with Moses being a close friend, but not quite at the same level. In Chapter 2, however, players are told something different. Double Exposure doesn't introduce its journal and note mechanics until much later on, after Safi's murder. This is where players can view Max's notes on all the characters and find her description of Moses, Safi's best friend, my acquaintance. It's completely jarring to read, and it makes no sense based on what players have experienced with Moses so far. Even if Max isn't very close with Moses, they still spend a ton of time together through Safi, and sometimes they make their own time together. Describing him as an acquaintance feels as though Max is experiencing some form of cognitive dissonance with their relationship, or more likely, is a victim of poor and inconsistent writing. Now, I've gone back, I've read the journal entries and Max's text after I finished the game, because I wasn't really interested, I was more interested in learning about Chloe and that, so I just ignored, like, most of the stuff. And to me, it's pretty clear that Deck 9 had different writers for these parts. Like, either that, or the writers were completely incompetent. Now, a lot of the game does feel rushed, that's why the story falls flat towards the very end. And I think this is because Enix was forcing Deck 9 to get Double Exposure out sooner, because, you know, when a game gets rushed, there's not going to be a lot of time for developers to double check stuff and make sure it's all good to go. And that's why these days you get games with riddled with bugs, and they have day one patches, which I think is ridiculous. Like, polish the game first, then release it. But whatever, regardless of what this reason is, it's surprisingly the less egregious, inconsistent thing that's in the game. A gunshot is heard, Safi is seen still alive, and this mysterious occurrence is never mentioned again. When Safi is murdered, Max is following her, having become worried about her while she's on a phone call that's clearly upsetting her. Right before Safi is shot, Max hears a gunshot and is gripped with fear. That panic dissipates, however, when she sees Safi walking and talking just a moment later. Then, when she finally catches up with Safi, she's dead. The fact that the gunshot is heard before Safi's death, and there is not another one to follow that could somewhat explain this moment, leaves an interesting mystery for players. However, this part of the circumstances of Safi's murder is never explored again. Without an explanation of a gunshot going off several moments before Safi's actual death by gunshot, players are just left wondering how she was actually shot. Since Max is later revealed as the killer, it could have something to do with her reality shifting or time rewinding abilities. Neither explanation fully explains the early sound of a gunshot, but it's the best rationale players have since it's never spoken about again. It can't be explained away by a possible audio bug either. Max reacts to the gunshot, it's meant to be heard, and she's meant to be relieved by seeing Sophie alive and well. It's a very cool and intriguing moment that's completely forgotten about. Due to where it takes place in the story, it leaves a glaring plot hole in Sophie's already convoluted murder. Now, I'll be honest, if you see my live stream, I was one of the people that was shocked seeing that Max was the one that killed Sophie. And it was about a week later, I think it was, or almost a week later, that when I was looking back at the footage, you can see Max is crying in the photograph when she shoots Sophie. So clearly it's not something she wants to do. Yet Sophie has done something irreversible that results in Max having to somehow travel back in time and kill Sophie. And the reason I say somehow is because when the first 2 episodes were released, all of us were shocked. We were playing as Max. We were walking up that little cliff area when we heard the gunshot and we saw Sophie and she died. So how can Sophie have a photo of Max when we were playing as Max? Now, a much better twist, in my opinion, would be that Sophie isn't the shapeshifter, someone else is the shapeshifter, and they deliberately shifted into Max to kill Sophie so that they could frame Max for Sophie's murder. That would have been a much better twist, and it would also have been a better explanation for Max to use her powers. Because if she's being framed for Sophie's murder, like, Max knows the consequences of using her powers, but it'd be a double-edged sword. If she does, there's a disaster that could happen, but if she doesn't, she could spend the rest of her life in prison. And for me, that's more compelling than just having, oh no, it was Max who did it all along. Because even an alternate version of Max, well, that'd be a bit of a stretch, but it would have made sense. Like, okay, it wasn't our Max that did it. And it just gets more confusing when Max uses a photograph in episode 3. So she travels back in time and she asks Sophie what's happening, and she sees a storm. And we'll get into that later, but you'll notice that there's no limits when Max uses her power to travel back in time, because Life is Strange 1, Max could never leave the area of the photograph. She had to stay within a certain boundary. Like, think about being under house arrest and you've got an ankle monitor on. If you leave the area, it starts beeping. So that's at least how I view Max's power. So in episode 4, towards the very end, when Max uses her photograph to travel back in time to after she took the owl, why doesn't she see this version of herself that killed Sophie? It just makes no sense. And speaking of making no sense, let's talk about the next inconsistency. Speaking of Sophie being shot, players never even see Max pull the trigger. Max is revealed to be Sophie's killer at the end of Chapter 2, Life is Strange Double Exposure. She and Moses look at the final photo Sophie has taken, which includes Max pointing a gun at her right before she's murdered. From this point on, Max is determined not to allow this future to come to fruition. It's the primary overarching goal of the story. Max must prevent Sophie's murder by simply not murdering her. There are a few issues with this. It's completely out of character for Max to murder anyone. Even players never even seen the moment happen in any version of reality, completely taking away any weight it could have held. And Max simply avoids murdering Sophie by choosing not to. Making Max Sophie's killer is weak and cheap right from the start. It's obvious when playing that Deck 9 was going for a plot twist that could rival that scene in the original Life is Strange, where Mr. Jefferson is revealed as the villain, and this did not. Like, I mean, in the moment it was like, holy shit, it's Max, but no, that Jefferson reveal, that was top tier. In fact, I'd make the argument that Jed from True Colors, that reveal was more shocking because you interact with him more than Jefferson, and Jeb's like a really nice guy. And he's like not faking it, unlike Jefferson, but yeah, that's a discussion we can have for another time. So it is phenomenal and it's a phenomenal and shocking moment. The twist perfectly crafted and executed, with many players not having picked up on any of the small indications that he was the culprit. And he drops hints. Literally, he tells Max, if you paid attention in class, you might have seen this coming. And it's true. If you listen to his dialogue, he discreetly mentions it. In Double Exposure, Max being revealed as the killer does not manage the same effect. Sure, she's the most unlikely suspect, just as Mr. Jefferson was in players' eyes, but players knew Max. They knew she would never kill anyone, let alone her best friend. So the twist is already ridiculous and difficult to take seriously. Even if players enjoy the twist or give it a chance to play out, they'll most likely be disappointed. Max is going through so many hoops to make sure she doesn't end up killing Safi, but she still finds herself at that exact moment. A gun pointed at her, with Safi asking her to pull the trigger. Players would think this would be a big moment, the big decision presented to them in the game. Instead, they're met with disappointment as Max decides to simply not shoot her. This isn't surprising at all because murder is not in her nature, and the idea that any reality exists where she does kill Safi feels ridiculous. Still, Deck 9 couldn't even commit to their ludicrous twist, finding the easy way out as they most likely realized it was a complete mischaracterization of Max. Max chooses not to pull the trigger on her own, once again ridding players of autonomy within a game meant to provide them with a hefty amount of choice. Because of this, players never see her actually pull the trigger, so how did Safi even end up dead in any instance? The photo Max sees is her version of herself thrust into a breaking reality due to Safi's loss of control of her powers. Even if this is meant to be a divergence in the timeline, not showing such a major plot point is quite a letdown and hinders any understanding of how it happened in the first place. It feels like a cop-out where Deck 9 suddenly realizes what they have just written, but it's too late to go back. Instead, they must try to fix it along the way, leaving mischaracterization and a huge wrinkle in the narrative. And that's true. They can't. It's like, it feels to me that they wanted to make their own story, and they wanted, because Max in this, her personality is not. She's not the same Max from the original game. Like, she is, like, you know, Hanatel reprised her role. It's the same character meant to be in the sequel, but she just feels off. We know that Max. It's not stated what she has, but it might be anxiety disorder or social anxiety. I'm not sure what the term is, but Max just has a trouble being like around people. She's not really a social butterfly, and this is used as a joke in Double Exposure, where they take like her little quirks and they just make it into little moments of embarrassment, where she's like, but they try to play her off as like moments when you're with Amanda, for example, or Vin. They try to make them look like, these little cute, quirky moments, but it just feels fake. And it's another example to me why the writers, they didn't know what they know they wanted Max, but they didn't know how to write for Max, and they didn't even know what story to write. So, and honestly, they should have had Max, if they wanted to bring Max back, have her in this game, but have another character be the main character. Because I think it would have been more interesting if Max had been murdered and we play as this new character who can shift between timelines, and Max acts as a mentor to this character, saying, you gotta be careful, I have powers, I know the consequences of what can happen if you use them. And speaking of powers, Chloe broke up with Max because of her powers, which she hasn't used since Arcadia Bay, which she can also use if she tries really hard. The web Deck 9 has woven surrounding Max's original temporal powers in Double Exposure is hard to unravel and lacks consistency. Players remember narrative director Felice Kwan sharing during the game's reveal livestream that Max hasn't used her powers since Arcadia Bay and wasn't capable of using them anymore. This made it quite a shock that within the game, the catalyst for Max and Chloe's breakup was due to Max being unable to stop using her powers. Chloe says in her note that the more Max goes back in time, the less she's looking forward, wording that wouldn't be used metaphorically by someone dating someone with time rewinding powers. It's obvious Max continued to use her powers despite Kwan's claim she didn't even know how anymore because she had long stopped using them. Of course, she apparently stopped sometime after her breakup with Chloe because she can no longer use them in Double Exposure. That doesn't last long, however. It turns out if Max really wants to and really tries, she can use her powers again. Specifically, her ability to go back in time using a photo. It's not a huge deal that Max can tap into her old powers, but the fact that it was driven into players' minds so thoroughly that she can't use those powers anymore makes it feel like a cheap moment to make the narrative bend how the writers needed it. Max will even say something to herself if players use the button that used to be designated for her rewind power, idly scolding herself for even trying it. Despite the trauma, insistence on never using it again, and apparent lack of ability, Max can and will use it because it's the easy way out for the story. Why think of something different when Deck 9 can use a loophole and shout, "Don't look behind the curtain"? Circling back to how Max's use of an ability to use her rewind powers have become a will they won't they situation within the game, Max later states to Sophie that she hasn't used her powers since Arcadia Bay. Given the statement, players now have no idea what was supposed to be the case of Max and Chloe's breakup. Her note clearly states that she's leaving Max because she doesn't know how to stop going back in time. Another way of clearly saying rewinding, but now Max hasn't utilized these powers since the events of Arcadia Bay. It's also wildly inconsistent since this affects major plot points explaining the exclusion of a beloved character. It's disappointing that Deck 9 couldn't keep their facts straight. At this point, either Max has a selective memory about using her rewind power, or players just have to accept that Deck 9 doesn't have a clue. But don't worry, she can still use them to save the day, because that's easier than writing something else. Now, I do want to wouldn't say I'm cutting Deck 9 some slack, but they're not the only one at fault for not having a clue of what to do. There's been a lot of games that have been coming out that, how should I say, tend to go soft, you know. We take a look at games from 10 years ago, like say Mass Effect, you got KOTOR, Alpha Protocol. This is just to name a few games of my list, where you are given choices, and those choices have consequences. And it's not like you can say, oh, okay, I'm going to do all the good outcomes, and it's going to lead to a good result, and I'm going to do all bad outcomes, and it's going to lead to a bad result. Now, granted, you can do that in these games. Well, you can't really be bad in Mass Effect. You can be an asshole, but not evil. But Life is Strange has never been about right versus wrong, good versus evil. It's about a person in the real world who gets powers, and how these powers affect their lives. And the endings of Life is Strange 1 and 2, they're not good and evil. Life is Strange 1, Max had to make an impossible decision. Does she let her best friend, or the woman she loves, depending on how you view Max and Chloe's relationship, does she let her die or to save an entire town? Or does she let an entire town die to save Chloe? And regardless of what ending you get, I truly believe Max would never ever use her powers again. The trauma of it all would be too much for her to bear. Now, I do think that if you remember towards the end of chapter 2, if Alderman finds Max in Moses' office, she ends up jumping back in time. I do think Max would have this power in both endings, because if you remember, there are certain scenes where, like, for example, when Max is in the dark room, if Jefferson goes to hit her with a tripod, or when David comes in and Jefferson stands behind Max, you'll notice that the screen kind of goes white and you hear like a... It's like time has frozen and Max has the chance to rewind that. So I do believe that if Max was put in a dangerous position, her powers would trigger a flight or fight response and just shift her back a few seconds. An involuntary rewind. But aside from that, no, I don't think Max would voluntarily use her powers. Now, Daniel is an interesting case because unlike Max, his powers don't cause chaos theory. And we know that when Daniel gets across the border, regardless of whether Sean is alive or not, he has no problem with using his powers. Yet, in the endings where he's still in America, whether he's living with his grandparents or not, it's not shown, but I'm pretty sure he would never use his powers again, because he'd want a normal life. Because if Sean's arrested, for example, I don't think Daniel would use his powers, because after everything Sean did for him and what he taught him how not to use his powers, Daniel would be like, okay, you did all this for me, I'm gonna respect what you want, and I'm gonna try and live a normal life and not use my powers. Now, it's not entirely true in the ending where Sean crosses the border and Daniel is under house arrest. You see with his grandparents, when they show when he gets photos from Sean in Porto Lobos, he uses his powers to push one of the photographs over to his grandmother so she can take a look. So maybe he used his powers when he was in the house with them around, but he wouldn't be constantly using them like he would in the other endings. The collectibles are Polaroids from an entirely different reality, and no, it won't be explained. Life is Strange Double Exposure's chosen collectible is Polaroids scattered throughout the world. These aren't normal Polaroids, however, they appear to leak from some different reality. However, the only other reality that ever leaks through is the parallel one Max spends just as much time in. While the game obviously implies the idea of multiple realities, it sticks with just these two. They're the only ones that can ever interact with each other and the only ones Max can hop between. Given these facts, it would make sense that these Polaroids found within the reality where Sophie is dead would have leaked through from the reality where she's alive. It appears to be a different reality where she's alive, but not the one Max keeps visiting. These Polaroids provide glimpses into an entirely different reality. Max will receive a small glimpse into the moment when they were taken, and that's it. It's also clear to her that this is an entirely different reality. It raises further questions. Can Max travel to other realities? Is the fabric of time and space collapsing due to her use of powers? And is that why another one is leaking through? Well, players looking for an answer are out of luck. The Polaroids are simply there and never further explained. Considering the plot hinges so delicately on the idea of these two alternate realities being the only ones Max can access, it's a bold choice to introduce the possibility of another reality peeking in and then not explain it any further. It's fun, who cares about a consistent plot? Deck 9 thought of a cool collectible, don't think too hard about it. Which, I gotta agree, what these collectibles should have been of is, if you remember in the Wavelengths DLC, Steph is looking around, not Wavelengths, in True Colors, when you play as Alex, you can find these collectibles, and where there's a strong, presence of emotion, and Alex can, sense this emotion, and she can end up, getting a memory of Gabe, or Jeb, or Eleanor, and this would have been a lot better, having these collectibles. Max look at them, and we get a look into the past, and we learn how Max came to Calderon, how she first met Sophie. That would have been more interesting and made more sense than having just what we got, because the fact that they just say, okay, so there's meant to be, instead of 2, there's 3 realities so far, but no, Max can't enter this third reality, and this third reality is where this other Max came from who killed Sophie. It makes no sense. Detective Alderman will be used for the plot however Deck 9 sees fit, regardless of if it makes sense. Detective Alderman is introduced to Double Exposure players as a potential antagonist. He's investigating Sophie's murder and is already profiling Moses, who is black, as being a potential culprit. Max immediately does damage control. She goes as far as to use her reality shifting power to prevent Alderman from finding Sophie's camera, an item Moses took from the crime scene, not thinking about how it could hurt him later. He simply wanted to keep a piece of his friend safe. Max uses her powers to sneak in and out of his office while Alderman is searching for it. Of course, she bungles things a bit when she accidentally swaps out a telescope still in boxes with another telescope that's already built. Alderman notices this and is completely perplexed. Before this, he spoke to Max alone and players had the option to play nice or be defiant. However, the player's decision doesn't seem to matter later on. Alderman shows up at Max's house asking questions, entirely suspicious of her, regardless of whether players chose to have a civil conversation with him earlier. Eventually, he demands to know what happened with the telescope. For him, boxes turned into a fully built telescope. He knew someone was in the room with him since Max wasn't the stealthiest person, but he never found them. Despite the situation being shrouded in mystery, Alderman puts the pieces together right away. Alderman is openly hostile to Max in the flip of a coin that's jarring to players who agreed to help him with the investigation. If players chose to have Max say she'll help him with the investigation, he's grateful. Regardless, he becomes hostile towards Max due to his apparent ability to piece together an impossible mystery with minimal clues. He tells Max he knows she had something to do with the telescope. Internally, she panics about Alderman figuring out her powers. This makes no sense. Regular people in the Life is Strange universe aren't widely aware that people with powers exist. If Alderman tried to use powers as evidence in the case, he'd be dismissed from the investigation. This sets up the next encounter with Alderman, which makes even less sense than the previous one. A guy just got wiped from existence, but don't worry, it's totally being looked into. After players explain their powers to Moses, who goes from the horrified and betrayed by Max's apparent killing of Sophie to totally on her team, reality appears to bend and twist. A version of Alderman from the day before appears in front of them. This impossible projection of Alderman isn't able to see Max and Moses, but they hide from him anyway. This version of Alderman is presented in the same way as leaks from the alternate reality are presented. However, he's actually the Alderman from this reality at an earlier time. He's seen investigating the crime scene, pacing as he tries to puzzle it out. At this point, Max establishes that there's something strange about this spot. The Overlook. The area where Sophie's body lay now has sprouted grass and flowers in the exact shape of her body. During winter, now Alderman's past self is walking back and forth in front of them. The idea that there's something strange going on about this particular spot is, of course, never explored or spoken about again. Why did a pattern of flowers and grass sprout in the exact shape of Sophie's body? Apparently, this detail wasn't important enough to explain. Deck 9 needs the Overlook to be a strange and special spot for this moment. However, because something downright jaw-dropping is about to occur, the present version of Alderman appears with a gun in hand, aiming it at both Max and Moses, demanding answers. Before the situation can escalate further, however, he sees his past self. It's not clear why people like Moses and Alderman can see this fraction of reality. It likely pertains to the supposed strangeness of the Overlook, but that's never explained further. Alderman is understandably freaked out, but also drawn to it. He's seeing himself in the past and can't help but approach and reach out. When Alderman makes contact with his previous self, it creates some sort of paradox. The two instances in time begin to combine and are sucked into some sort of reality wormhole. Players can attempt to pull him out or let him get sucked in. If Max does try to pull him out, she's unsuccessful. Moses pulls her away, which earns him an unexplained grey patch in his hair. Alderman and his past counterpart have just been, to quote Max, yeeted from existence. After this, Moses investigates and confirms that Alderman now never existed. Reports of a widow suffering from sudden abdominal pain the year he was meant to be born are all that's left of him. Once this is established, it's never spoken about again. The primary antagonist gets wiped from existence bizarrely and dramatically, and Deck 9 essentially says, "Crazy, right?" Anyway, it's a huge plot point that's original to the game, and they simply abandon it. There is no further explanation for the apparent supernatural essence of the Overlook, and that is not to mention of Alderman's obliteration from existence in both realities. It's also strange delving into a breach in time rather than simply a leak from an alternate reality. For whatever reason, a past version of Alderman appeared in front of them, presented in the same way that Max sees her pulses in reality. It leaves so many unanswered questions. It seems like Deck 9 either forgot or thought it was a self-contained moment players wouldn't want to know more about. Now, I don't know about all of you, but I for one am the most disappointed in how Alderman's character was presented, because unlike all the other characters, I felt he had the most potential to be a great, if not antagonist, maybe just like similar to David from Life is Strange 1. You know, you don't really like him, but, and yes, his relationship with Chloe, there was a lot of problems, but at the end of the day, he saves Max's life, so I felt that could be something similar that Deck 9 was trying to do. Because, I've got to go back, I've got to do the Sacrifice Chloe World State playthrough, but I believe that him going off at Max when in my first playthrough where Arcadia Bay was destroyed, I think that was completely justifiable, and I do believe that it could have been handled a lot better. Like, let's say for example, Max chooses to sacrifice Chloe, right? So Arcadia Bay's fine, nothing else happens. The telescope still switches places between timelines, and it's put together, and like Alderman saw the telescope put together. He doesn't know what's going on, and later, when Max decided to help him, he could talk to Max, and he's there because he knows something weird's going up, since like he talked to her, and then like he has no proof that Max did anything with the telescope, and as the reading went, if he were to say she had powers in court, he'd be laughed out. It'd be ridiculous. But I think in that world state where Chloe is dead, he would maybe talk to Max, and he's trying to figure her out, be like, okay, I don't know what's going on, but this case is very strange, and I have no other leads but you and Moses. But if Arcadia Bay is destroyed, and he finds out while researching who Max is, he could be like, okay, I don't know how, I don't know what's going on, but you are somehow involved in this case, and I'm going to figure it out. Because, let's face it, as human beings, we are rational, and when there's something irrational, we have to use logic to explain it. And if we can't explain it with pure logic, it's going to drive us mad. And so I can see him freaking out at Max in her home. Now, I do like what they did with how Alderman was gotten rid of. I do wish there was an option to bring him back, but I think that was great, especially how it showed the consequence of Max's powers, because as we know in the first game, Max's consequence for using her powers was chaos theory. But having reality start to break, that was great. And it's a shame that Alderman was killed off. Maybe, like, I heard someone saying that he's in that nightmare sequence from audio logs, from the leaked audio logs, but I don't know, I haven't seen him in that at all. But it would be pretty interesting if Max was able to save him, then I do believe he could have become a potential ally and help us figure out who murdered Sophie, why it happened, what's going on. But sadly, that never came to be. And the thing about, like, because Reggie, if you remember, before that stuff with Alderman happens, oh no, so no, this is in the other timeline where Sophie is dead. Reggie is freaking out that he saw another person, and he saw himself out on the Overlook. And in this timeline, Sophie is dead, so it's not going to be Sophie shapeshifting as him, but rather it would be a past him he's seeing, just like how Alderman saw his past self. And that could have been pretty good, but it didn't happen. So, and plus, you know, it happened in the dead timeline as well, so that would have been interesting. Maybe what they could have done as a consequence, instead of the storm, which I'm going to be talking about next, instead of the storm, have Calderon University, have people of Calderon University see their past selves, and if they touch them, then they're faded from existence. And in the timeline where Sophie's alive, she ends up messing with people's minds because she, as she states, she puts a piece of herself in them, and maybe she ends up driving them insane and causes them to die. And so one timeline has to be destroyed so the other can thrive. I don't know, but that didn't happen. Deck 9 wanted to have their cake and eat it too, and it doesn't work for a Life is Strange game. The endings, in my opinion, they have to be bittersweet. You can't have a happy, or you can have like worst endings, but you can't have happy endings. You know, they got to be bittersweet. But anyways, let's move on. How does shapeshifting turn into a tear in the fabric of space and time in a massive tornado? Sophie has the power to shapeshift. She's able to turn to anyone she's met in real life by altering people's perceptions of her. This is a cool power to an extent. If Sophie could change into anyone she'd ever seen before, it would make more sense, and it would have a lot of potential, especially in her more sinister moments with Max. Instead of taunting Max with a reflection of herself, why not turn into that ex who got away, who she still regrets having lost? Initially, Sophie's powers seem cut and dry. However, after she receives devastating news, the entire campus is thrown into chaos. Every single person is possessed by Sophie and is unable to do anything other than echo their thoughts and echo her thoughts and devastation. Players have tried to rationalize this by assuming that Sophie leaves a piece of herself inside every person she's ever shapeshifted into. However, this explanation falls apart when players remember that the entire campus is being possessed. Sophie hasn't impersonated all these people. So why is the whole campus suffering from this possession? How could Sophie's power cause this? This is another question that isn't answered at any point. But possession goes hand in hand with the nonsensical plot point involving a huge tornado threatening the campus, which is apparently due to the chaos Sophie's powers are causing. This means Sophie's shape-shifting abilities are responsible for possessing the entire campus, sending everyone to some sort of time vortex, purgatory, and causing a humongous tornado. Why is this the case? Sophie's abilities only alter the way people perceive her, so they don't have much of an effect on reality itself. Deck 9 wanted to bring back the tornado, so they had Sophie's power cause it all without considering what caused the tornado in the original game. Life is Strange is based on the idea of the butterfly effect. It takes it in a very literal sense, with the symbolic presence of a butterfly and Max's continued use of her powers resulting in a huge catastrophic tornado. The butterfly effect is an idea previously proposed by a meteorologist, posing the idea that the flap of a butterfly's wings could cause a tornado weeks later. The butterfly effect eventually expanded past the concept of weather formations and more often pertains to time and how every action has a tangible consequence. Deck 9 ignores this carefully crafted use of a tornado within the original game to slap it into their game simply without explanation. Max saves the handful of possessed people Sophie has impersonated at some point. This actually makes sense as she uses her camera to free them of the piece of Sophie living within them. The dissipation of the tornado, however, does not make sense. After Max attempts to use the photo of herself holding the gun to Sophie to fix things, the storm is still raging, and now it's just Max and Sophie stuck in purgatory. Following Max's refusal to shoot Sophie, she takes her hand and walks the two of them directly into the storm. How that works is not a question that players should even ask. This is a special storm, technically an angry time vortex. Again, what does this have to do with the story? And it welcomes them right in. Max and Sophie find themselves in another purgatory, but this time it's calm and they can talk things out. They figure out that Max still holds a piece of Sophie in her from the time she's impersonated her. When it's removed, they are returned to reality and everything goes back to normal. Well, almost. The two timelines have converged. Sophie's alive, everyone is confused and traumatized, and players are given no explanation for how shape-shifting could cause this. While the storm appears to be made of two realities, the catalyst is Sophie's loss of control over her powers. The storm doesn't seem to have anything to do with changing timelines and says goodbye once its role is over. The original Life is Strange presents two logical ways to deal with the storm. Players can let it rage or keep it from happening in the first place. Players can let Chloe live even though she was saved by Max tampering with time, or go back to that moment and not rewind time. If players choose the latter, the tornado won't happen because it was directly caused by the butterfly effect. In double exposure, the storm is never a real threat. There's no explanation for its arrival, and it goes away once Sophie's powers are under control. Now, I don't know about all of you, but this to me, the reason they brought back the storm, it's completely stupid, and the dickhead who came up with the idea should be fired. Like, we know, as it just explained, chaos theory is the reason the storm happens. And that was the whole point of Life is Strange 1, you know? If Max wanted to save Chloe, the storm had to happen. She can't have her cake and eat it too, so to speak. Now, I don't think that they really thought this through. I thought they just stuck it in. Oh, remember this? Like, if you ever see that South Park episode, the member berries, I remember. It's like they're trying to put out a lot of stuff. Oh, this was in the first Life is Strange. Here, this is a little Easter egg from the previous game, but it doesn't work, especially if we're saying Sophie's powers caused a storm. Why didn't Daniel's powers cause a storm when he overreacted at the end of episode 3? Remember, like, his powers go haywire, he explodes, everyone gets hurt, Sean loses an eye. Where was the storm then? Where was the storm when Alex used her powers in true colors? It's clear that Deck 9, the writers hadn't thought this through, and they were just putting this together because, ooh, look, remember? But yeah, overall, it feels like an underwhelming. It's an underwhelming thing to put the storm in. The storm was a real threat, and for me, honestly, I felt like Max didn't understand the gravity of the situation until episode 4 when she sees the two moons, because I felt that they were so focused on finding Rachel, and like they found her body towards the end, and after that they go to confront Nathan at the Vortex party. But once Max sees the two moons, she's like, oh shit, okay, we need to do something. But she's sticking by Chloe's, and so I think in my mind she's just delaying the inevitable. She doesn't want to accept the fact that that this storm really is going to happen. And then when episode 5 rolls around, yeah, it's like, even when in the Everyday Hero contest, she gets a call from Chloe. Chloe's like, the storm, it's fucking real, Max, you were right. So, and then she's like, oh man, like I gotta do something, and we know what she has to do to stop the storm. But there's just no, like, just slapping a storm in and saying, ooh, another disaster, that it makes like no sense. It's just there for a little, like, oh, remember Life is Strange 1? But yeah, I think it was stupid, especially if we're counting in the powers. So, you know what, that's from now on, if you want to find out who has powers in Life is Strange, just pay attention to the weather. You know, if you see a storm, okay, someone has powers over there. It's real ridiculous. The catalyst for Sophie's breakdown makes zero sense. Sophie loses control of her powers due to overwhelming emotional turmoil. After outing Lucas for plagiarizing the work of Maya Odekar, Sophie's best friend, who took her own life because of this, Lucas speaks to her privately, and suddenly everything goes wrong. Players don't get to know what Lucas says to Sophie when they try to eavesdrop. When they try to eavesdrop, Max uncharacteristically says she shouldn't listen and that Sophie will tell her later. Unfortunately, that ends up not being true, and instead players have to try and infer what Lucas said. Before everyone is possessed, there's a moment where Lucas speaks to Max and Moses after his conversation with Sophie, telling them that they have no idea what they've just done. This implies that there may have been a misunderstanding over what happened between him and Maya. Instead, Lucas reveals something that he shouldn't even know, and it's unclear why he chooses to share it. While players actually never get a rundown of the conversation, it appears that Lucas told Sophie that her mother had her book deal cancelled. She's understandably hurt and outraged over this, and everyone feels the effect. Who told Lucas about this? Sophie's mother, Yasmin, is the president of the university, but Lucas is just an employee. The only other person who knew about the book cancellation was Gwen, Sophie's mentor, but she's not close to Lucas either. Why would he know about it? When Max finds Sophie confronting her mother, Sophie mentions that her mother has been pulling the strings all along. Sophie even says that her mother kept her father away from her. Everyone else was possessed, so Sophie clearly didn't speak to anyone else between her conversation with Lucas and her encounter with her mother. It seems like she only could have learned about it from Lucas, but how did he have all this information? Just go with it, okay? And speaking of the possession, I should have mentioned this before, but how does she possess everyone? Like, we know that she puts pieces of herself in people that she has to transform into. So why does it work on Moses when she specifically says, I never changed into Moses, he's off limits, so he shouldn't have been affected, right? And Max, why wasn't she affected? Because I think maybe her powers made her immune, but it would have been interesting to see something. If you ever seen the movie Logan, Professor Xavier has seizures, and we see that Logan isn't as affected because of his healing factor, a weakened one, but still it just causes him pain and he struggles to move, but he's got some sort of immunity to it, so having Max fully immune to Sophie's power doesn't make sense either. It would have been interesting to see, like in episode 2, where Max is struggling after she freezes time to get to Kate. It would have been interesting to see Max moving. She could have maybe fell to the ground, her nose is bleeding, but she keeps pressing on to get to Sophie. Where is Max's counterpart? Deck 9 doesn't explain how Max is able to exist in the alternate reality without running into the other version of herself. When Max arrives in the new reality, Sophie is waiting for her, and the actual Max from that reality is nowhere to be found. When Max goes to her home in the alternate reality, she comments that it appears this version of herself hasn't been home in a while. This isn't explained any further. Double exposure players just have to accept this is what's happening and not question it. Max took the place of an alternate Max for the sake of the plot. In the Life is Strange comics, Max goes on a similar journey, arriving in an alternate universe without running into herself. Eventually, it explained that this version of Max most likely died at Jefferson's hands, leaving the space of her arrival open. Now, I actually made a theory video about this, which I'll discuss later, but let's continue with this first. Initially, it seems like it could be an alternate universe where Max died instead of Sophie, but that becomes impossible once it's revealed that Max is the killer. How did Max arrive in an alternate reality where her counterpart clearly had a life without causing a time paradox or running into herself? Well, don't ask Deck 9, because they don't appear to know either. If they did, maybe they would have bothered explaining it. Max arrives in an already lived-in life that's suddenly vacant and waiting for her for no discernible reason. Now, what it mentioned about the comics and Jefferson killing Max, that's not true. In fact, I do have an idea of what happened. You see, I actually came to this realization when I was making theory videos about where Chloe could be if she isn't in double exposure. Was she visiting David, or is she busy at a job? But we now know that they broke up. But in the comics, in volume 1, Max is entering the minds of alternate versions of herself. She's doing this subconsciously, not of her own free will. Eventually, she goes to an alternate timeline. Let's call it the Amber Price timeline, in which Chloe and Rachel left for Seattle. Now, I always thought that Max stole this body of this alternate version of Max, as towards the end of the comics, when she gets back to her timeline as reunited with her Chloe, she takes the body as well. But it wasn't until I started making that theory video about what Chloe does for a job that I realized what happened. Tristan explains to Max that the reason he was able to go between other timelines is because the versions of him in those timelines are dead. And he theorizes to Max that maybe that's why she was able to go to his timeline, because she's dead in that timeline. And I do believe what happened was Max died the same way Rachel Amber did. Because Rachel and Chloe left for Seattle, California, wherever they went, this means that Nathan never drugged Rachel and accidentally overdosed her. So Max ended up taking her place when she arrived at Arcadia Bay. Which is pretty sad to think about it, because, and I do think, like, Jefferson would have been absolutely pissed, because to him, Max was the perfect subject. He admired her above all. He probably, we know that he was making out with Rachel Amber, and he explained to Max that Rachel was like a chameleon. There were so many opportunities, there were so many outcomes for him to take photos of her. The possibilities were limitless. But with Max, there was just something captivating about her, so I think he would have preferred her over Rachel Amber. Now, with Nathan, the things still would have played out the same. So, instead of Rachel, Nathan drugs Max, tries to impress Jefferson, ends up overdosing her. Max gets buried in a junkyard. Jefferson, realizing Nathan's a liability, would shortly kill him afterwards, so Nathan doesn't jeopardize his what he considers, his vision of what art is. And so Jefferson, in the Amber Price timeline, is still going around drugging poor girls and taking pictures of them. And it would have been interesting if Deck 9 had this approach. Let's say, what if Sophie killed Max? And so when Max saw her again, Sophie was so confused, she doesn't know what the hell is going on. How is Max alive? And perhaps she goes there and she checks out where she buried Max's body, and she's like, Max is here. It's like, what the fuck is going on? And then she slowly comes to the realization, she doesn't know what power Max has, but she's like, Max has powers. It's like, I need to figure out what's going on. And that could have been a good excuse for her breaking into Max's home and going through all the photos and that. That would have been very interesting. But there was also another thing that's interesting as well. If I've actually saw this in a video. If players decide they want to go on a date with Amanda in episode 1, in episode 2 Amanda brings up that Max ghosted her for about 2 days and she never heard back from her, and it's never addressed again. So, like, having that Max possibly be killed off, that would have been interesting and that dialogue would have made more sense. But clearly Deck 9 wasn't thinking about this stuff when they wrote it. But anyways, that's really all the plot holes here I wanted to talk about. I would like to know your thoughts in the comments below. Please like, share your comments, your opinions, and I'll see you on the next video. This is TotalGamerJunkie, signing off.